the word and the will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west. Let all the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who journey with them be organized into companies. Let each company provide themselves with all the teams, wagons, provisions, clothing, and other necessaries for the journey that they can.
On January the 14th, 1847, President Brigham Young addressed the Saints camped at Winter Quarters, Nebraska. Driven out of Nauvoo nearly a year before, they had set out on the road left open to them, the road west. Part of their way followed crude trails, but most of the time the Saints made their own road. This is the story of how they made it, 1,073 miles from Winter Quarters to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. There must have been a mixture of excitement and foreboding in the air the day the Pioneer Company finally left. Those who stayed behind continued the routine tasks of daily camp life. Those who departed carried with them a sense of destiny and purpose. They were making a road for the Saints to follow. In early April, Elders John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt returned from their mission to England, bringing $500 worth of scientific instruments for astronomical observations. They also brought maps, including one of John C. Fremont's route to the Great Salt Lake. On the afternoon of April the 14th, Brigham Young and the Saints completed preparations and started west, leaving Elders Pratt and Taylor in charge at Winter Quarters. By 8:30 the next night, the last of the wagons had forded the Elkhorn River and traveled 12 miles beyond to the camp on the north bank of the Platte, about 47 miles from Winter Quarters. It was from there that the westward journey really began. April the 16th, 1847. It would last exactly 100 days. 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children traveled in the original Pioneer Company. They took 73 wagons, 1 cannon, and 1 boat called the Revenue Cutter. The companies of 10 were organized into 2 divisions. The order of travel was altered so that a different company of 10 would lead each day.
Every morning, a bugle called us up at 5 o'clock. The 2 hours until 7 o'clock we spent praying, cooking, eating, and caring for the animals. At 7, the camp moved out. No man left his wagon without permission from his leader. Everyone who wasn't driving a team walked with his loaded gun on his shoulder or at easy reach within the wagon. In times of danger, the wagons traveled double file. At night, we camped with the wagons in a circle to form a corral for the animals. At 8:30, the bugle would signal the close of the day. It was time to go to the wagons for prayers and to retire by 9.
Thomas Bullock and William Clayton functioned as camp historians, and many others kept personal journals. Orson Pratt's records included scientific data, which he gathered daily with the instruments brought from England. He also kept records of geological formations, as well as records of plant and animal life. The Saints traveled the north bank of the Platte River to assure better access to feed, fuel, water, and peace, because they were not alone on the way west. The Oregon Trail, which followed the Platte on the south bank, had many travelers that spring, including some former adversaries from Missouri. Taking the north bank caused a problem the south bank travelers avoided, crossing the Loup Fork. For miles above where the Loup River entered the Platte from the north, the ground was treacherous with quicksand and swift currents. The first attempt at crossing was nearly disastrous. Only 2 or 3 wagons crossed that day. The next day, a better ford was found upstream, where the current was not too swift, and the sand would pack to provide a solid foundation. Only on the Sabbath was the routine interrupted. Despite the desire to hurry to their destination and begin planting seeds, Sunday was a day of rest and worship with tents pitched for shelter. April the 25th was such a Sabbath day, the camp gathered for Sunday services.
George Albert Smith related the prophet Joseph's instructions. not to kill any of the animals or birds, or anything created by Almighty God merely for the sake of destroying it, but only when we needed food. The advice was timely. That week we sighted our first buffalo. Excitement and a certain fear of the unknown accompanied the 11 chosen hunters. Our final tally stood at 1 bull, 3 cows, and 6 calves. A circumstance far exceeding our expectations and best hopes, and all without the slightest accident or loss to man or property except Luke Johnson's cap and a ramrod to a rifle.
The buffalo meat was welcome. In addition, buffalo hide were large and useful, and buffalo chips made good fuel. On May the 4th, the company camped near Grand Island, on prairie that had been burned by the Indians to encourage the growth of new grass. The pioneers burned the prairie behind them to provide better grazing for the companies to follow. 4 days out of Grand Island, William Clayton erected a cedar post near the Platte River, which read, "From winter quarters, 295 miles, May the 8th, 47. Clayton eventually began to erect such a post every 10 miles. It was one of the many ways they communicated with other camps. At times, they inserted letters in slots cut in boards, and any eastbound traveler was pressed into service as a mail carrier. The method of painting a message on a buffalo skull was used so often, it became known as the Bulletin of the Plains. May the 10th, the pioneers passed the confluence of the North and South Platte Rivers. From here, they would follow the North Platte to the Sweetwater River in Wyoming. Each day, William Clayton recorded, among other details of the trip, the distance traveled. At first, this was determined by guesses, which differed by 2 to 4 miles. Then Clayton decided to measure the distance exactly. He measured the circumference of a wagon wheel, then tied a piece of red flannel to a spoke and spent the day counting revolutions. That got so monotonous that Clayton proposed that a mechanical counter of some sort be built. At President Young's request, Orson Pratt designed a machine having 2 cogs and 2 endless screws, one cog to measure each mile, the other to measure 30 miles. A skilled mechanic named Appleton Harmon began work on the device following Orson Pratt's design. Known as rodometer, it was attached to a wagon wheel to count miles and tenths of miles. Later, another cog was added to rotate once every 10 miles, showing each mile and also each quarter mile. On May the 24th, the company reached Chimney Rock, one of the most famous landmarks on the trail, almost halfway between Missouri and the Salt Lake Valley. Landmarks were considered very important because they gave a sense of direction and location. May 29th, the Sabbath day. Brigham Young spoke against a tendency to quarrel, play cards, use profane language, and spend too much time in dancing and merriment.
If you are willing to humble yourselves before the Lord and consent to the right and walk humbly before him, make it manifest by raising the right hand.
The vote was unanimous. June the 1st, the pioneers made camp across the river from Fort Laramie, 543 miles from winter quarters and halfway to the Salt Lake Valley. Fort Laramie was, at that time, the hub of the western fur trade. It was here that the Pioneer Company met a few saints from Mississippi who had wintered in Pueblo, Colorado, with a detachment of the Mormon Battalion. Also at Fort Laramie, the Mormons heard news of their old antagonist, former Governor Boggs of Missouri, who had passed earlier with a group of Missourians. Boggs and his group had said many negative things about the Mormons and warned the people against them. James Bordeaux, superintendent of the fort, greeted the pioneers cordially, saying, "Let the Mormons be what they might. They could not be worse than Governor Boggs and his men." On June the 3rd, 1847, 4 men were sent to Pueblo to guide the rest of the Mississippi Saints to Laramie. The other pioneers rented Mr. Bordeaux's flatboat and crossed the North Platte River. Fort Laramie stood at the southern end of the Black Hills, where the rugged terrain forced the Saints to cross to the Oregon Trail on the south bank of the Platte. The way would be easier, but the grass and campgrounds would have to be shared with others. For this was the main route west. Here, the pressure of thousands of westbound wagons wore deep ruts in the sandstone. The pioneers would follow this well-traveled road for nearly a month.
On June 12, Saturday, we arrived at the Black Hills Crossing at a place later called Fort Casper, Wyoming. We constructed a large raft for ferrying the wagons. On Monday, we finished the crossing and left the revenue cutter, some rafts, and 10 men behind to ferry later companies of saints and other travelers. We regarded the money and supplies they earned ferrying as manna from heaven in the wilderness. From the Black Hills Crossing, we followed the Sweetwater River past two famous landmarks, Independence Rock and Devil's Gate.
On June the 16th, they reached South Pass, a wide expanse of sagebrush and prairie line at the southern tip of the Wind River Mountains. This was the Continental Divide. June the 28th, the saints met the famous fur trapper, Jim Bridger. He spoke favorably of the valley, but advised against taking a large group there. On June the 30th, Sam Brannan reached the camp on the Green River. He had traveled from California to persuade the saints to come to what he considered the more favorable San Francisco area. Though unable to prevail upon Brigham Young to travel on to California, Brannan accompanied the saints during the rest of their journey. July the 7th, the pioneers camped 1/2 mile from Fort Bridger to make repairs on their wagons and equipment. On July the 10th, they met a farmer, Miles Goodyear, one of the first white settlers in the Great Basin. He had a farm in the Weber Valley. Mr. Goodyear assured the saints that in spite of the cold winters, crops would mature. But the valley still seemed far away, and blazing the mountain trail was hard, discouraging work. Then on July the 12th, Brigham Young fell ill with mountain fever. He was forced to stop and rest near the Bear River. The next day, the pioneers were divided into 3 groups. Orson Pratt's advance company was assigned to take 23 wagons and 42 men and go ahead into the Salt Lake Valley. They were followed by the main body of the company, and then those who stayed behind with Brigham Young. Orson Pratt's company traveled 13 miles to the junction of the Weber River and Echo Creek. From there, they planned to take the Hastings Cutoff down Weber Canyon. They found it too treacherous, so they followed the Donna Reed route southwest over Hog's Back Ridge into Canyon Creek, the present-day East Canyon. They traveled south up that canyon to a place they called Mormon Flat. The going was rough as they crossed East Canyon Creek 13 times.
July 19th, Orson Pratt and John Brown rode their horses 4 miles to a pass on Big Mountain and became the first Mormon pioneers to gaze into the Salt Lake Valley. Crossing Big Mountain was the hardest climb of the whole trip. Our scouts investigated what was later called Parley's Canyon, rejected it as too rugged, so we crossed over Little Mountain into Last Creek, later known as Emigration Canyon, and camped. On July 21st, Orson Pratt and Erastus Snow entered the Salt Lake Valley. Brother Pratt reported.
Brother Snow and myself ascended this hill, from the top of which a broad, open valley lay stretched out before us. After issuing from the mountains among which we had been shut up for so many days, and beholding in a moment such an extensive scenery open before us, we could not refrain from a shout of joy, which almost involuntarily escaped from our lips the moment this grand and lovely scenery was within our view.
After emerging from Immigration Canyon, they walked into the valley and turned south to a small stream later called Mill Creek. While Erastus Snow retraced his steps to find his lost coat, Orson Pratt rode the horse northwest to a point 1 block north of today's Temple Square and became the first Mormon to stand upon the present site of Salt Lake City. On July the 22nd, the main group joined Pratt's company and camped 5 miles into the valley by Mill Creek. The next day, July the 23rd, the main company moved north to set up a permanent camp on City Creek. Thomas Bullock recorded this as 1,073 miles from winter quarters. It had taken 100 days to make the journey. The last 40 miles alone had required 4 days. At 9:30 that morning, everyone gathered for prayer and thanksgiving, and then chose a farm site and began to plow. By nightfall, they had dammed City Creek, dug ditches, and begun to irrigate the land. Finally, on July the 24th, 1847, Brigham Young's detachment entered the valley. President Young raised himself from his bed, looked at the valley, and knew it was the place the Lord had chosen.
This is the right place. Drive on.
4 days after his arrival in the valley, Brigham Young walked to an area between the two forks of City Creek and designated the temple site. The saints had come to worship and to build a temple, and they would build their city around it. The next day, 140 members of the Mormon Battalion and 100 of the Mississippi Saints entered the valley. Other companies followed during the rest of the summer and fall. Eventually, some 1,800 Saints stayed that winter in the newly established settlement, while some members of the original company returned to East to be with their families. In his journal, William Clayton expressed his feelings about the prospect of the return trip.
If I had my family with me, how happy I could be. I dread nothing so much as the journey back again, and when I think of the many dangers from accident which families traveling this road are continuously liable to, and especially this last mountain road from Weber River, it almost makes me shudder to think of it.
Brigham Young himself led one of the companies of men back to winter quarters, where he gave the necessary leadership as the Saints prepared for their western journey. They had been guided for 3.5 years by Brigham as head of the Council of the 12. Now, on December 5th, 1847, the first presidency was organized, with Brigham Young as president, Heber C. Kimball as first counselor, and Willard Richards as second counselor. They were sustained by the Saints at winter quarters on December the 27th. The next spring, the Saints resumed the western migration. Wagon train after wagon train brought them to their new home. The road was ready. It had been prepared, mapped, and marked. There were thousands who followed it over the years, each one of them building upon the 100 days' work of that original company, each one building his place in the top of the mountains, free to worship God in peace. Nearly a year before, they had set out on the road left open to them, the road west. Part of their way followed crude trails, but most of the time the Saints made their own road. This is the story of how they made it, 1,073 miles from winter quarters to the valley of the Great Salt Lake. There must have been a mixture of excitement and foreboding in the air the day the Pioneer Company finally left. Those who stayed behind continued the routine tasks of daily camp life. Those who departed
The word and the will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west. Let all the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who journey with them be organized into companies. Let each company provide themselves with all the teams, wagons, provisions, clothing, and other necessaries for the journey that they can.
On January the 14th, 1847, President Brigham Young addressed the Saints camped at Winter Quarters, Nebraska. Driven out of Nauvoo, had carried with them a sense of destiny and purpose. They were making a road for the Saints to follow. In early April, elders John Taylor and Parley P. Pratt returned from their mission to England, bringing $500 worth of scientific instruments for astronomical observations. They also brought maps, including one of John C. Fremont's route to the Great Salt Lake. On the afternoon of April the 14th, Brigham Young and the Saints completed preparations and started west, leaving elders Pratt and Taylor in charge at winter quarters. By 8:30 the next night, the last of the wagons had forded the Elkhorn River.
Every morning, a bugle called us up at 5 o'clock. The 2 hours until 7 o'clock we spent praying, cooking, eating, and caring for the animals. At 7, the camp moved out. No man left his wagon without permission from his leader. Everyone who wasn't driving a team walked with his loaded gun on his shoulder or at easy reach within the wagon. In times of danger, the wagons traveled double file. At night, we camped with the wagons in a circle to form a corral.
And traveled 12 miles beyond to the camp on the north bank of the Platte, about 47 miles from winter quarters. It was from there that the westward journey really began. April the 16th, 1847. It would last exactly 100 days. 143 men, 3 women, and 2 children traveled in the original Pioneer Company. They took 73 wagons, 1 cannon, and 1 boat called the Revenue Cutter. The companies of 10 were organized into 2 divisions. The order of travel was altered so that a different company of 10 would lead each day.